Cadena 3 Argentina. El campo hoy. El segmento diario de Cadena 3 Argentina está orientado al sector agropecuario, con las últimas novedades y acontecimientos importantes de este sector, informando y acompañando al hombre de campo y a la mujer de campo. Cadena 3, la radio del campo argentino.
Somos REM, la red de manejo de plagas de APRESID. Nos encargamos de reunir a productores, expertos y empresas para generar información y promover el manejo integrado de malezas, insectos y enfermedades. También difundimos la actualidad del manejo de plagas a través de diferentes herramientas como jornadas técnicas, alertas de resistencias, notas y también el mapeo de tanto malezas, insectos o enfermedades.
Thank you. Good afternoon, welcome. As the spokesperson has said, we will give the floor to Jorgelina, who has a master's degree in agricultural sciences. She works at Anguil, at INTA. I'm an agricultural engineer, work at INTA Rafaela, and I'm part of the REM program, a program which has organized this lecture. So Jorgelina will talk about residual herbicides and their behaviors and the results achieved during the last season. Jorgelina, the floor is yours. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, APRESID. Thank you to all of you. I'm going to share with you, first of all, some theory and then some examples of projects we have carried out. And I'd like to clarify that my work is focused basically in the area of in the area of influence of the Tandil experimental site. So the information is focused on that area, the south of Córdoba, the west of the province of Buenos Aires, and the east of the province of La Pampa, with rainfall figures of 500, 600, or even less. Sometimes there's higher rainfall with sandy floors. And I'm interested in this because most of you are colleagues and you know the influence the weather has and the kind of soil has on the behavior of residual herbicides. That's why I believe I was invited to participate or to take the floor because of what happened in the last growing season when there was limited rainfall, and this influences the behavior of residual herbicides. Well, I have already told you a little bit about this, and on this slide we can see the factors that have an influence when we use residual herbicides. Why are we interested in this issue? Why do we want to find information? Why do we look for this information in the databases? Sometimes it's not available, but we have to try and find this information to understand the behavior of these pesticides. And when I talk about behavior, I'm talking about our goal, weed control during the period we are interested in, when we have the fallow, and while the crops are growing. And we don't want these herbicides to go into the environment either, especially because of surface
percolación profunda, pudiendo alcanzar agua
because of surface leaching, or because it leaks down into the underground water tables. So these tools are very good, but they have some limitations so that we can use them in the best possible fashion. which are the features we take into account, especially the physical and chemical properties, and this is information we need in order to manage the herbicides the best possible way. So these herbicides interact with the kind of soil, the pH, organic matter content, microbial population, rainfall, temperature, humidity, wind when they are applied, and also the way they are applied, if it's pre-emergence, post-emergence, etc. So this, and especially, well, once we have applied a herbicide, any phytosanitary product or agent, first of all, it will be affected by the environment. So depending on the physical and chemical properties, it will have more affinity to go to one or another environmental section or sphere in which the environment is divided. So we may think that if there is a high steam pressure, they move up into the air, the atmosphere. If it's they're highly likely to build up in the biota, and here we pay more attention to the residual components. If they have high or low affinity with the soil, they will be sequestered in the soil, and this changes depending on the soil features, and if they are highly soluble, they will get into the water, edaphic water, or they may also run away on the surface until they meet surface water tables. So everything we apply goes into different compartments. On the other hand, once a kind of dynamic balance is reached with these environmental compartments, they may pesticides may be transported. Maybe they were sequestered. It was sequestered in the soil, but there is an intense rainfall. The residual herbicide is there available, and it may get lost, and it may get to the underground water tables. This is part of leaching, a leaching process. We may also have surface runoff until it reaches surface water ponds. So everything we apply to the land, we want it to stay there, and we want we want the products to be there, to stay in the floor, to control the weeds for a given time. So we also wonder, how long do those weed killers stay, persist? What do I mean by this? How long this product stays on the surface? So I'm going to sample it, and I find residues. For how long will I still find a positive result when I take samples? This is persistence. Residual capacity means for how long it will control weeds. And the process, the reverse concept, is dissipation. That is, how much time goes by until we stop finding remaining elements of this weed killer in the soil or in any other product, because we may find pest control products on a banana peel, for example. This is persistence, and dissipation is related on one hand to the physical and chemical properties of weed killers, the environmental conditions, and the general conditions of the land. And dissipation is the result of the losses, or the drivers that remove the residues. This may be the result of volatilization, leaching, photodegradation, chemical and microbial degradation, the plant metabolism. The plants absorb the residue, the herbicide residues. That's why we control weeds, but the crops also absorb these herbicides. So this gives rise to the dissipation. So if I'm working with chemical fallow on bare land, it's one thing, but if I'm applying a weed killer on fallow with weeds, if there is a lot of fallow, the product will stay on the land much longer. If we think about degradation, which is the physical or chemical breakdown or degradation, we may think of a theoretical curve. This is time, days, and concentration on the other axis. I start with a concentration, a given concentration, and we have these degradation curves. The concentration drops. The concentration of the original component drops as time goes by. And how do we define this process? One way of defining it and being able to compare products among them with other products is the mean life. You read the label of the products and you can read information about the mean lifetime. This is the average time this product that
A la mitad de la concentración inicial.
this is the time the product the time that has to go by until the product level goes down to 50% of their initial concentration. Here it moved from 1.3. After about 50 days, the amount went down to 50% of the initial concentration. I use this to be able to compare products with each other and to know how long they will stay on the soil. So, and we have the half-life here. Not all of them are residual, but it's important to have this information because here we know where we will find residual components. We will find them when they have a half-life that is sort of related to the residual level. A residual product with a very short half-life won't be a residual one. Here we have those that have 10 to 20 days of half-life. We can see them on the list. Most of them are here in a moderate half-life, 30 to 90 days, sulfatazone, chlorimuron, chlorsulfuron, and they have been ranked. The number of days goes up. In some of them have a long half-life, over 200 days at the very bottom, and their persistence is quite long. But we have to be careful here because these very long persistences may interfere with the following crops. The crops that come after this one in the rotation. We call this the carryover process, finding residues of herbicide in the crops that comes after the crops to which this herbicide was applied. And we find it in the following crop because there is a long persistence. This is the result of the half-life and of other factors that are related to the absorption and solubility, because the product has to persist, but it must be available in the soil, bioactive, to control weeds. And solubility is very important because we know that water in the ground will regulate the availability of the elements that have been added to the soil. And we need these pesticides to be bioactive and to control weeds. But if they persist for too long, it may cause issues with the following crop. Adsorption process, we may find information. This is a KF. That is how the herbicide is distributed between the solid components of the soil, the organic matter, clays, texture, the mineral components, and the solution. What the distribution is like when it gets to the soil. Part of it is trapped in the soil, and the rest is gets into the water, into the wet part. So this is, we have the KF or a KD, depending on the relationship between this distribution, whether it's linear or not. But this is the information we need to understand whether the weed killers will stay in the soil or not. This defines the rates. Too. Not all weed killers tell us in the label what the right rate is depending on the organic matter content of the soil or the texture. So, but this helps us to understand whether there will be high retention or not, and it will also enable us to adjust the rate, taking into account this coefficient. So, the higher the absorption coefficient KD or KF, the higher the retention in the soil, the lower the availability.
And sometimes you can find this other coefficient, which is the absorption coefficient, KD, over the organic carbon, because absorption occurs over the organic fractions, because it has more possibilities to interact, more absorption sites, and it plays a role when herbicide has to be retained in the soil compared to the mineral fraction. This is the plotting. This is the soil full of water. Part is in the soil solution. This is the bioactive part that controls weeds. But if we have significant rainfall, this product can leach down into the soil profile. The deeper it goes, the less possibilities to break down, because breakdown occurs due to microbial activity, and that activity is at the surface, not 2 or 3 meters down. And in underground water, it's unlike the breakdown is unlikely to happen. The part of the herbicide is retained here, this dynamic balance on the solid fraction of the soil. Depending on the moisture or water content, there is absorption, desorption balance, but to some extent, this is accumulated inside the solid fraction of soil, in the micropores, nanopores, in that sort of tangling between the organic matter and the mineral fraction of the soil. Herbicides are sort of entrained or trapped, and the only way to flow through is through the breakdown of organic matter, so they become available again. There are adsorption, desorption processes. This has to do and is related to what I said before. Part is adsorbed, but part is also desorbed and passes into the soil solution. Herbicides, residual herbicides, respond to the soil pH, some of them. This means that it will have an ion charge depending on the pH in the soil, and this will result in having a higher or lower probability to be retained in the soil. And this is another piece of information which is important. We need to look for this information when we use the product in order to understand how they are going to respond to the soil pH. What will happen in the silane area, in the saline area, on what will happen in the saline slope and what will happen in the crest. This is interesting because it explains the behavior of herbicides in the soil. Generally, we pay attention to this when we have a problem. We will be interested in what the pH is or what was the texture. Oh, now I understand because it has a pH of 8. So all these things are important to be taken into account so we can do a better work. There are herbicides that have an ionic behavior as the pH goes up, and we will find them as an anion. Others, we are going, as the pH goes up, we will find them as a cation. And if they are in a neutral, if they are neutral, if they are cationic, they will have a different interaction with the soil. For instance, a nitrate or anions, they are replayed by the soil charges, so we lose them, they leach away. So we could make an analogy with the nitrate to understand this more clearly. Which are weak acid? Those that above the pK will be presented as anions, and we can lose them. The imidazolinones, here we have glyphosate. We have glyphosate because it is also a weak acid, but it interacts in some other way in the soil. It tends to be retained by oxides and hydroxides in the soil, and this results in a high retention of the glyphosate in the soil. When you spray and plants have dust on the surfaces, this also causes a high retention, so it is not absorbed by leaves, so it gets or reaches the soil, and it has a capacity to be retained. It can also be desorbed, so it might pass onto the soil solution. Occasionally, it can be lost in the soil profile with heavy rain. It is easily broken down by microorganisms. Then we have other residual herbicides, which are also residual or weak acid. The triazines are neutral or cationic, mostly neutral, and they don't respond to the pH. They have high retention in the soil. So we play with these aspects. Once we spray the herbicides. Parts can be non-extractable because they go into the nanopores. There is another part which is difficult to desorb, and this is the bioactive or bioavailable fraction, which is the one that will help us control weeds. It will depend. The degradation will also depend on the molecule structure, because everything is not dependent from retention and from the breakdown. This has to do with the compound itself, and we can tell whether it will be easily broken down due to the microbial activity. When microorganisms get to the floor, are not identified as something in nature. So others are some are more difficult to be broken down, and others are easily broken down because microorganisms find a substrate, and so they can easily break them down. We have had some experience, and we have some findings I share with you. This is in my region. This is in Anguilla, semi-arid area or adjacent areas. But we are going to have a Q&A session. We can explain this further with Fomisafin, how we are interested in this, how we are interested in having this information. First, because we know that there is a serious problem with the pigweed complex, so the use of fomisafin has increased in different production systems, and it has a mean life of 100 days. And this gives us some signal of alert. What happens in lighter soils, what happens is we have little rainfall. What happens if there is low or medium absorption coefficient? Is not water soluble, it behaves as an anion, and the pK is 283. And what is the history? What anaerobic conditions promote its breaking down? So when there is water in the soil, there's more breakdown. And we have drought, the breakdown, it will break down less. So it's interesting to know how it behaves. We have conducted trials in Anguille and Manfredi. Although soils were not that different, the soils were loamy soils, and this is a loamy clay. The differences had to do with the rainfall during the trial period. First, we see 17 millimeters between the first spray and the first sampling date. We made we sprayed the soybean, and then we took periodical samples, and then we came up with bioassays with the crops we were interested in: corn, soybean, wheat. The difference was at the first date of sampling 17 millimeters in Anguille, 80-90 in Manfredi. April the 12th, 63 in Anguille, 356 in Manfredi. And by September, we have 211 millimeters rainfall and almost 500 millimeters in Manfredi, which were the global results that we obtained. These were visual inspection or assessment of the plants preparing pots of corn, where the depth was 0 to 10 centimeters for maize and 10 to 20 centimeters. That was the sampling depth. And at 0, there were no symptoms. From the beginning, we were able to see that at 10 to 20 centimeters deep, the levels of phytotoxicity were less. So this means that the product remained on the surface. So when I suspect that there may be a carryover, I have to prepare pots with the surface layer at about 10 millimeters deep. I will have information there. We have also tested OX, 1X. There was 250 grams of active ingredient per hectare. We doubled that and we fourfold that. In Anguille, for the different sampling dates, we see that the first rate until September, we have significant phytotoxicity symptoms, whereas in Manfredi, the first sampling date was January. Was having that date, we can use this to replant some things. So it's a trial. We wanted to have the information from January. We had sprayed the product 20 days ago. By September in Manfredi, the symptoms disappeared or were dissipated, so there was no visible symptom. This foliar or leaf surface area, we are going to pass it over. We'll see that if we have high rainfalls above 211 millimeters in Anguille, in Manfredi we had almost 500 millimeters. Even before this, there was no phytotoxicity symptoms. And this has to do with the breakdown for possibility of foamicaphan in an anaerobic condition or with soil moisture. In Anguille, we have to pay attention when rainfall is at least 211 millimeters, whereas in Manfredi they have other rotation choices. We also conducted trials in the Anguille area. that was wheat, the number of plants as of 2,500 cubic centimeters of flex. We have some loss of plants, but with the single rate, we had no problem in spite of the low rainfall that we had, 330 millimeters at the planting date of wheat. So that is a very good piece of information, because this is telling me that if I work with the appropriate rate, 1.250 rate, which is the one indicated in the label, I won't have any problem. I can have some overlapping situation in the head areas. There are scenarios where flumesaphane is used in post-emergence, and in post-emergence it is repeated, or have a rate is repeated. If there is a problem of water deficit, we have to pay attention as long as we are considering this kind of soils. These are the symptoms that we can find. This is a carryover trial that we completed a short time ago. The field trial was conducted in 2018. This information is very recent. We also consider the flumesaphane carryover on cover crops. We know that this practice is being implemented more and more, and also we can have early planting, not only waiting for the harvest. Sometimes we can do air or broadcast planting in an earlier date. So we wanted to see what was the carryover behavior with triticale or bran with rye, with summer crops. We can explain this chart. These are curve adjustments to determine the minimum required time for planting. For instance, rye. This is an index of phytotoxicity. We have defined a threshold 3. If I make an assessment, and I have a damage higher than level 3 that was up to 9, I consider that threshold 3 has a light symptomatology, and the plant has the possibility to be recovered. This is a reversible symptomatology, some light symptom in the leaf. And we found that for this low rainfalls in the different sampling dates, that was after 23 days, 127 days, 194 days, and more than 200 days, and the rainfall was 200 plus or 300 even. For rye, for the simple dose, the single rate, for rye, we see that as time goes by, the phytotoxicity symptoms go down. For rye, then, I could plant with a single rate, an early planting for cover crop or winter cover crop. And for rye, I could do that, but for the double rate, 2 rates. But considering a later planting date. No, sorry, this is rye. I made a mistake. This is rye that was the most sensitive crop compared with triticale, and we couldn't do an early planting. It was 260, whereas triticale behaved as a more tolerant crop compared to rye, considering flumesaphane residue. So when you are interested in having a cover crop in a specific rainfall in dry years, the triticale would be an interesting option when talking about flumesaphane. On the other hand, we conducted these trials for corn and sunflower. This year in particular, again, I want to point this out. This year, which was a very dry year for La Pampa, with a single rate, we were able to plant at date, on the proper date. However, for corn and sunflower double rates on any areas where there was some overlapping, we could have some carryover problems. These are the symptoms. The different species, this is typical of the PPO, this tanning, this necrosis, this browning. This is the final result. Here we have the complete information of 280 accumulated millimeters at the planting date for corn and sunflower. This is low rainfall, but we were able to plant with a single rate. We made some trials with bicyclopiron. It has more than 200 days of mean life, so we have questions and doubts as to how soybean behaves, which is one of the most sensitive to bicyclopiron in the soil. This was a very special year, very particular year. Between the previous crop and the following period, we are considering the carryover. Complete crop cycle was completed on the next year. 900 millimeter rainfall we had. In general, we see that with single rates, there was the accurate gold which we used for the trial. It was 2 liters. We didn't have much problems. These are not significant differences. And whereas when we considered a double dose, a double rate, we saw some lines that had the damages. Although the rainfall was 900 millimeters, if we work with the rates stated at the label, on the label, there would be no problem.
Interrogantes.
Topamazone is another product with a long half-life. We can see it here, 218 days, highly soluble. And what we know is that soybean is one of the crops that is most sensitive to this agent. And if topamazone is associated to chlorus issues, it's used quite often and it's very effective. So the point is, could we have some issues with the rotation? And this is a scenario of a commercial plot where they didn't use the label rate. They used 120, and the following year, though there had been a rainfall of about 700 millimeters, the crop had all these symptoms. And maybe you cannot see it in the picture, but it applies to the whole plot. So it's important to know and abide by the label rates, the rates suggested in the labels. But we should also take into account the soil, the rainfall, and the rotation, because sometimes we exchange recipes among several regions or different regions, and each region is unique. These were the symptoms. We ran some tests in Anguille with loamy soil 2 and a little bit more of organic matter. This is the one we saw earlier on where we got to 200 millimeters. This is wheat, and though we didn't identify symptoms when wheat was planted, we had 140 millimeters. When we planted wheat, the rainfall had been 140 millimeters. We didn't see any phytotoxicity, but at harvest time, there was a reduction in yield. And again, the rainfall had been 140 millimeters. And, well, we didn't know whether there could be carryover or not with this agent. We ran some tests. This is the same test, but with sunflower, where we got to 200 millimeters or so. With the lowest rates, there weren't too many symptoms. The suggested rate was 100, but we tried to go with 80 to see if this was better or safer. And what did we find? That there was some damage on sunflower. There were some losses, but there weren't any changes in yield because sunflower is very responsive. But it's not nice to go to a plot and instead of finding 4 or 5 plants per square meter, you just find 1 or 2. So the 80 or 100 rates with 200 with the given rainfall, I'm checking to find the right rainfall. I believe it was 240 millimeters when sunflower was planted. So, as I told you earlier on, all this information is available and it is adjusted for each component. There are tables which we may use and review to be able to interpret this information, because sometimes we find information and we don't know whether the figure is too high or too low. So there are tables that help us to classify the situation considering half-life, absorption coefficient, solubility in water, whether they are ionic compounds or not, what happens with the pH, and also the steam pressures. All these compounds have different parameters, and we should take them into account to use these agents in the best possible way according to our production. In our production systems, there is information which we have published. This is last year's flyer, but we are currently, this new virtual workshop has just started at Broca. This is platform. This is an inter-platform for distance education. We had it even before Zoom came up. Today we use other tools for virtual training and education. This is geared towards agricultural engineers. There are papers by all the people at INTA, by colleagues from different universities. This was published by engineer Mr. Leguizamon, and I believe you have received this leaflet or brochure prepared by Mr. Benkman and Mrs. Gianeri from Balcarce, and we also have virtually this book chapter, which you may download if you want to find out more information about these themes and issues. And that's it. Thank you very much. Jorgelina, thank you very much for your outstanding presentation, and I have received some questions, and in the meantime I'd like to remind the audience that if you have questions you may submit them to the WhatsApp number you get through the QR code. The first question is this one: which is the effect of pre-emerging products in green weeds, and which is the threshold to decide whether you're going to control those emerged weeds or to use a pre-emergent agents? Well, this depends on the kind of pre-emergent agent you're using. Pre-emergence agent, sorry. I mentioned this for only a second. When I mentioned the parameters of the compounds, there is one which was whether it went to the biot or not, is KOW. This one will tell me whether the product will attach strongly to the weeds. When there is a lot of weeds, depending on the product we will use, it will be attached to the weeds. The same happens with the cover crops. What do? Do I use the pre-emergence agent right now or not? So we should know what kind of products I will be using. Mainly these ones, which are not ionic, we might say, generally speaking, that they are going to be kept or retained more than others. But as all these elements interact with one another, the coefficient, the octanol water coefficient is very important, because this will tell me whether the agent will be retained or not. Solubility is also important. KOC also provides information here, but the most important thing here is the octanol water coefficient we want to know. So we have to define the agents we're going to use, and of course the mass, the biomass of weeds, because if the kind of cover we have, because we won't be talking about absorption. It's just that you have something that prevents the product from reaching the soil or the weeds. So the biomass is key. And this other issue, which is important too. Sulfentrazone gets easily to the soil after rainfall. The same with other products, but some other products have a harder time to get to the soil, and we need to get the right information to make a decision, the right decision, and make the best possible use of the agent. The next question relates to the fomensafen trial you shared with us. What benchmark we should use, whether it's rainfall or days after the application. The millimeters of rainfall are key. I believe that we still have to consider and merge all the results to find, to consider the information about days and millimeters. First, I would go to millimeters, and after that, I would take into account days. We saw this in the data provided by Mr. Gustavo. After 23 days, there were almost no issues, or it was an important drop or reduction in the symptoms. I believe the first thing to take into account is the rainfall. When we talk about different active ingredients, when active ingredients are combined, do they behave differently from the individual active ingredients? They keep their individual characteristics and properties. They don't change their behavior if we mix them. This is a question about tillage. After applying residual agents before planting, do they get buried when you plow the land? That is, you apply and after that you plant. Well, there is some movement there. And sometimes we think, we hope that we will keep a layer of this agent on the surface, and once we are plowing, we sort of break that layer. But rainfall plays a key role here, because there may be a spread out of the product once it's dissolved in the land. I don't know if I have answered the question or not. Let's have another question. Lactofem. From the moment you apply it, how long should we wait until we plant wheat? Well, I have run a trial, but I haven't analyzed the results yet. I would say that it's not a product which has a high residue life, so to say. So I believe there won't be any important limitation for wheat. Now, use of sulfentrazone in corn, and which is the rate for?
Primero tenemos que ver si está registrado.
First of all, we should see if it has been authorized. It hasn't been authorized yet. Sulfentrazone.
Sulfentrazone y flumioxazim para año seco y húmedo.
Sulfentrazone for different cases. Sulfentrazone is a herbicide which is more soluble and which has a lower absorption coefficient. So in dry years it will be more available than flumoxazine, if this is what we are looking at. And now a question about your tests and trials. How do you manage the water in the flower pots to analyze the half-life? How do you manage the irrigation in the pots, flower pots, in order to study the half-life? Sorry, I got you wrong. Well, we water them in a way well, just in case the water is lost from the water pot through percolation, we don't make a hole at the bottom, but we don't give them too much water either. So we don't saturate the earth. We try to keep it close to the field capacity. There aren't any further questions. If you have any other questions, you may ask Jorgelina later on. So let's continue with the next talk, and let's give Jorgelina a round of applause.
Agro TV, toda la tecnología agropecuaria en acción, mostrando las experiencias más exitosas y rentables de los productores de punta, promoviendo el aumento de la producción en forma sustentable, respaldando el cuidado del medio ambiente y los recursos naturales.
Moderna, diferente, sustentable, 100% digital. Revista Horizonte A, Ciencia y Cultura del Agro. Léela en horizontea.com o pedila a info@horizontea.com.